As a discipline, most of you will know, philosophy deals with 6 different fields of human knowledge: logic, epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy of religion, ethics, and political philosophy. On the other hand, not many people can see philosophy as an activity. However, philosophers such as William Lovehead reminds us that philosophy can be described at least in 4 different ways. You could describe it as the search for self-understanding. Namely, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to have a personality? You could also describe philosophy as love in pursuit of wisdom. And we say wisdom, not just knowledge. It's knowledge plus understanding plus human experience. You could also describe philosophy as the search for the purpose and meaning of life and history. Why are we here? And at the end of our short life, is it it? Is that the end of everything? And finally, philosophy can also be seen as the search for fundamental beliefs that are rationally justified. And of course, there we have the problem of God's existence and whether or not it is rationally or irrational rather to believe in God. Now, it can be claimed that some of these descriptions of philosophy can also be applied to theology as an activity, not as a discipline. However, that's not the topic that we are dealing with tonight. Rather, what I would like to say is that while celebrating the work and life of Juan Luis Segundo, we could also start our presentation by using 2 similar questions. Namely, what is theology? And what is theology for? And if we would rely on Segundo, he will tell us that the purpose of theology is twofold. On the one hand, the purpose of theology is to clarify doubts. On the other hand, the purpose of theology is to answer questions. But then you are going to ask, who is doubting? Who is asking the questions? And the response of Segundo will be, those people who, believers or not, try to reflect seriously on what they truly believe. And that is quite interesting because already from the very beginning of his understanding of theology, his project is aimed at a very different kind of audience and at a very different kind of people. In any case, what we could immediately point out is that theology in the thinking of Segundo is a two-way street. And in these two-way street, processes of communication are fundamental. In that sense also, monological or top-down theology, in his eyes, can be meaningless and honestly quite boring. It is considering such a purpose, the purpose of Segundo's way of doing theology, way of theologizing, that Segundo reformulates the Christian faith and offers a more up-to-date and liberating version of it to people. Of course, we all know that images or ideas of God are of absolute relevance in theology. Well, it just happens that in Segundo's liberating theology, the God of Jesus, who happens to see as the Christ, is a God who is concerned with and passionately interested in the good and well-being of humankind. Therefore, Segundo believes that Christian theology, in fidelity to that idea of God, must highlight that the option for those who live in inhuman conditions is the perspective or lens from which the followers of Jesus need to interpret his message, or in general, the Word of God. And so, in his view, by speaking meaningfully about God, Segundo's theology aims to help humankind to become fully human. And here then, in this way of doing theology, the criterion of truth is based on the idea that thinking with Christian faith on you, informed by Christian faith, enriches our vision of reality and enables us to reach a deeper commitment to others. Segundo believes that we need to free theology and religious practices from all the alienating and paralyzing elements contained in them, to be able to transform the earth into a place more conducive to brotherhood and justice. Humans must be liberated from their alienations and make life more humane. And why? Well, Segundo's idea is that God wants human beings not to miss the opportunity to leave their mark on history with the best that they have. That is to say, the capacity to love and build justice amid a reality full of injustice and inequality. That is the reason why Christians and humans together must help build relationships and pluralistic structures that foster compassion and oppose indifference and passivity. While I'm stating this, does the situation of Gaza or Yemen or Nigeria or Sudan come to mind, perhaps? Now, let us be clear about this. Segundo never stated things on paper just for the sake of expressing his ideas or personal opinions. He always paid serious attention to the magisterium of the church. For example, in the case of the purpose of theology that we just discussed, he was fully aware that the magisterium encourages theologians and Christians in general to follow that path. Because, as the magisterium has clearly acknowledged, it often happens that, and I quote, a dogmatic truth is initially expressed incompletely, though not falsely, and later, seen in a broader context of faith and knowledge, it is expressed more fully and perfectly. Taken from Mysterium Ecclesiae of 1973. Similarly, Segundo has also pointed out that Vatican II in Gaudium et Spes 11 says, and I quote, the human mind must be directed toward more humane solutions to the problems posed by its current context. The theologian, hence, is called to reformulate the faith in dialogue with members of the church and those interested in understanding their own faith. Now you can see the description of theology that he gives and the fundamentation of it. In this regard, in the context of Gaudium et Spes 11, Segundo's liberating theology is interdisciplinary because he was fully aware that in the construction and production of theology, philosophy has always played a very important role. And the reason is clear. The truths of faith seek in the systems of thought of their cultural context the mental and linguistic tools to express their content as precisely as possible. Nowadays, that's what I think, we can claim that only through the cooperation and complementarity between philosophy, theology, and science, our problems can be illuminated and humanized. But then, to move on and talk about Segundo then. That's part of the way that he does theology. But who was Segundo? Segundo was born on October 31st, as we already said, 1925, in the city of Montevideo, Uruguay. And there, in Montevideo, he spent most of his life. However, he was frequently away from Montevideo, first because of his studies of philosophy and theology, and later because of his many courses and lectures that he gave at universities and training institutes in different countries. And as I already mentioned, he died on January 17 of 1996. Now, in the homily of his funeral mass, Elvio Medina, his closest friend and companion of journey, on that occasion, Elvio presided over the celebration, and he describes Segundo as a pioneer of theology, as a wise teacher and as a classic of contemporary theology. So why is Salvio claiming that Segundo was a pioneer of theology? And the response is because indeed, even before the Second Vatican Council, Segundo was already thinking and writing about themes and ideas that only after the Council began to gain ground and became part of the thinking and action of theology and the Church. For example, it was Segundo who, along with other pioneers like Karl Rahner, began to reflect on the issue of the salvation of non-believers. Prior to that, nobody was thinking about that, let alone saying something in public. Segundo was also a pioneer because at that moment he was also talking already about the Church's responsibility to rescue and take seriously all that is valuable in society and the world. And it was Segundo who, from his earliest writings, suspected that at some point in history, elements alien and contrary to faith had penetrated it to the point of alienating its content. So, it was from these ideas that Segundo's liberating theology was born. And this is the reason why he aimed at liberating theology from all its alienating and dehumanizing elements. Now, Elvio Medina said also, Juan Luis Segundo was a wise teacher. Why? Well, because his reflections and epistemology changed the minds and hearts of many of his listeners and readers, including myself. But that was not the big deal. The big deal was the number of atheist people back in Uruguay who was reading the articles and the books that he produced, to the point that the atheists were urging the University of Montevideo to create a chair for him so that he could teach theology in their national university. But further than that, for more than 30 years, Segundo mentored several generations of students, young people, but also adults, and even professional theologians, including many of the theologians which are active in Brazil. In addition to that, Segundo taught us to face life's essential problems with courage and by looking straight ahead. This was what he demonstrated to us all when in the early 80s he called for an amnesty for Uruguay's political prisoners, something that at that moment was extremely dangerous. In fact, the magazine that published Segundo's petition and article was immediately shut down. But even more, the courage of Segundo was also clear, was also demonstrated when he wrote his most courageous and dramatic book, whose title is Liberation Theology, Response to Cardinal Ratzinger. Can you imagine Segundo telling the Vatican why in public that their theology was bad? unorthodox theology. That was Segundo. Finally, Medina says also that Segundo was a classic of contemporary theology, not philosophy. Because even during his lifetime, his work was already being studied by dozens of students and scholars of theology, including Alfred Henley, Arthur McGovern, Javier Jimenez Limón, Fernando Verdugo, and Elvio Medina Sal. Besides, thousands of people have read his books. His more than 5,000 pages have been edited and translated into several languages, including English, French, and Portuguese. Juan Luis Segundo was a master of masters and a true representative of contemporary humanism in Latin America, and that recognized both in Spain as well as in the USA, in addition to the countries of Latin America. And as I said, apart from all of this, Segundo was one of the founding fathers of what in the early 70s came to be known as liberation theology. Yes, I know, you could be telling me, we all know that Gustavo Gutierrez is generally recognized as the father of liberation theology. Yes, I agree with you. However, what many of us don't know is that Segundo and Gutierrez were very close friends for many years, and that this friendship of both of them was born and grew precisely here, in this country, in this city, when they were studying here. Segundo studied not here at the Catholic University of Leuven, but at the Theologate, which was those days in Egenhoven, Heberle, and Gutierrez studied here at the Catholic University of Leuven. They coincided in the years, from the 53 to the 56, when Segundo was here. Therefore, at the professional level, Gutierrez refers to Segundo's work with these words: "It is the most important attempt in Latin America to address the different facets of the impoverishing rupture between faith and life." Segundo attempted to speak to the people of our time, believers or not. Segundo wasn't loud or media driven, but his commitment to society and our times was visible in his daily work, constantly focused on promoting the humanization of people. Therefore, it isn't surprising that he criticized religious and cultural models and behaviors that lead to the depersonalizing and dehumanizing situations that we all experience. And so, his books speak not only of non-believers and the theological and cultural elements that have alienated the Christian faith, but also of the alienation that has led many believers to believe, among other things, that suffering and poverty are something desired by God, or that God punishes those who disobey his laws equally. Thus, in a world that dehumanizes men and women today, apart from proposing a reformulation of the Christian faith, Segundo also carries a clear message we must unmask and reject everything that humanizes and robs or destroys the possibilities of creating greater dignity and justice and history. Here I will deviate a bit to recount a bit of the elements that I already told you about. First, I think it is clear to you why I claim that Segundo was the co-founder of liberation theology, by having stated that they studied here in Belgium, that they were close friends, and in fact, the first years when they went back to Latin America, all continued working first with university students. But the second element that I would like to explain to you, and why I see the humility and the fidelity of Segundo, is his connection to the Pedro Faber Center. And that's a story that started in 1975. That was the year when Segundo wrote his most systematic book, namely Liberation of Theology. He wrote that book, which is a series of lectures that he was invited to teach at Harvard on the occasion of a new chair that they had created for experimental theology. But in 1975, it just happened that the military regime had already started in Uruguay, as it had already started in other countries as well, South America. And by then, Segundo was the director and the founder of the Pedro Faber Center. Originally, the idea of creating that center was to promote the social teaching of the church. And that idea came from this country, not because he learned about it here, but because at that moment the general of the Jesuits was a Belgian Jesuit. His family name was Janssens, Father Janssens. And Father Janssens, I suppose with the inheritance that he had from Rerum Novarum, that Professor Liede Bube can explain that to us as a Belgian perhaps at another moment, the connections and the impact of Rerum Novarum in this country. With that in mind, Father Janssens proposed that in different countries in Latin America, there should be different centers to promote the social teaching of the church. And so that was the beginning of the Pedro Faber Center. Segundo said, I'm ready to do that. And he started together with some of his companions, brothers of the Jesuits, to find a house, to start accommodating the house, and waiting for people, other Jesuits who were studying in different universities, so that when they finished, they could start the work. And they did a very good job, because the preparations would have started around 1965, and by 1975, it was already 10 years that they had been working. And they had been very successful in many ways. But as I said, in 1975, it just happened that the military regime was already governing Uruguay. And the military regime wanted to know who was causing trouble, who was injecting the ideas of socialism and communism in society. And it just happened just by coincidences that first the guilt was given to the Archbishop of Montevideo and the General Vicar, and then to the Jesuits. And it was at that moment when Segundo needed to leave Uruguay to go to Canada. There were investigations from the side of the military trying to find out who was causing all the trouble. Many people were arrested in civil society, and the Jesuits, of course, were blamed seeding the ideology in the country and the church in general because of the Archbishop and the General Vicar, who, by the way, had nothing to do with anything, neither the Jesuits nor the Archbishop. But it was just a coincidence because that day, well, the day that the last ambassador of Cuba was in Montevideo, many people had gone to the airport to say goodbye to him. And the General Vicar, just by chance, was also there, but for a very different reason. But then, when that was happening, the military regime took many prisoners. Those people who were saying bye to that ambassador took them as prisoners. And the General Vicar saw it and said, yeah, this is unjust. And so he wrote a letter. But that letter then linked him as being a sympathizer of socialism, communism. And so he was blamed, but together with the Archbishop, because if the General Vicar was doing that, it should have been with the authority of the Archbishop. And then, of course, the Pedro Faber Center was also guilty because of the articles that had been published in different magazines and the books that were being produced. So anyway, Segundo had to go to Canada, and he went. And while he was in Canada, the military regime came to the Pedro Faber Center, took away all the books, everything, all the library, everything that they had been collecting already for 10 years, took the books away, put them on fire and such. And when Segundo was back from Canada, the rest of the Jesuits were afraid of him, because the only one who was living in the Pedro Faber Center was Segundo with another Jesuit, and then two others who were also at the beginning there. But ever since the military regime was blaming them for all the trouble, then they were put aside. And with the time, those people left. And so Segundo and his other companion were left there for 8 years. And then eventually, when 8 years later, finally Segundo was left alone, because the companion who was still faithful there at one point said, enough is enough. And he left the Jesuits, and he left the religious life, and he just continued working as a normal person, and he did very well. And Segundo was left alone, and he continued still living alone there for a good period of time, perhaps 3 more years. Finally, in the last years, before I spoke with him, finally he was invited to come to join one of the houses of the Jesuits in Montevideo. And so when Segundo was telling me the story, was telling me that after the government had put on fire all the books of the library, he had no more bought books, because he didn't have the money. He was living by himself, and he was telling me, I was living out of my books and the money that I got paid when I went to teach different courses. And so you can see that's being faithful. That's to have convictions. That's to have ideals. Not many of us, not many humans have that. Probably many of us would have left immediately. He did not. Anyway, I finished that part. Then I already told you a bit of that story. I still want to say a few more things. That's part of what he said. I have always lived in a certain poverty, which does not allow me to buy a library after the event of the Pedro Faber Center. I live from the selling of my books. We had a professor whose name was Terry Merrigan. Professor Liebebuben knows him. Professor Liebebuben and myself were almost classmates. Did I finish first? Or you did?
When did you finish?
I finished 96.
95.
Yeah, so he finished first. Okay. So at that moment there was a professor whose name was Terry Merrigan, and he was in charge of Louvain Studies. I think Louvain Studies is still alive, huh? Yeah, okay. So at one point, when Professor Merrigan realized that I had an interview with Segundo, and when we realized that he was in '96, he was dead, then we proposed that we could write something about Segundo. And so Louvain Studies, the magazine, then dedicated this issue to the theology of Segundo. I call the theology of Segundo in the understanding that I had as his theoanthropological project. And so in this issue, you will find articles written by a classmate of us whose name was John Rees. But then we also had another theologians, Odair Pedroso, Alfonso Murad. They wrote here. And at the end of this issue, I have this interview, which was translated into English, which I had with Segundo in 1994, where he told me the stories that I was telling you about. And so that was the way that here, the faculty and the university honored the work of Segundo. After this interview was published in English, 2 years later it was also published in Portuguese. And I think somebody from Sao Paulo had already read the interview, and they called me to ask whether it could be translated. And so it was translated and published also in Portuguese. However, this interview has never been published in Spanish. And not so long ago, I was listening to, was watching a television program, and they were talking about liberation theology. And I was a bit disappointed because many of the things that they were saying were inaccurate. And so I went back to look at my notes, and I found the interview, and I reread the interview. Then I realized, oh my goodness, this is still very, very much to be recomposed. It is so applicable to what we are living today. So I decided to rewrite the interview, and now I'm trying to publish it in Spanish. This is the draft. In Mexico, the Pontifical University, they are reading the text, and I hope that soon they will tell me whether or not they are interested in publishing it. But well, I'm telling you about the story of Louvain Studies and these ideas, because it is there where we have the main elements that can help us to interpret the theology of Segundo. I say that the main ideas begin with the idea of the commencement of faith, or the beginning of faith. When does faith begin? That was a question that he was exploring at a certain moment. And it was in 1955 that he was exploring that question with one of his professors at the Theologate in Eindhoven, and the name of that professor was Leopold Maleve. And Maleve pointed out that idea about the beginning of faith had already been discussed in the Second Council of Orange in the 6th century. And so Segundo got interested in that because that idea of the commencement of faith indicates that there are not two spheres of reality, the natural and the supernatural, as at that moment it was being taught. Everything is a big sphere of reality where the touch of God is there from the very beginning of history. And when we say the very beginning of history, we say it from the very moment when that singularity, the astrophysicists talk about it, that singularity took place 13.7 billion years ago. And so from that idea, all the evolutionary process up till today, we have the presence of God's grace, so to speak, in the creation of the universe and obviously the world. So that's one idea that is fundamental in the theology of Segundo. Nothing is not blessed by the presence of grace of God. Everybody is included. Then there are other elements like the hermeneutic circle, which is also very important. Can we talk with the Bible? Can we see in the history of the Hebrew people the stages of development of his thinking with regards to his understanding of God? That is what, at the end of the day, the hermeneutic circle is all about. From today, we go to the past. We ask, in view of that history, what was happening with them. Were they growing? How fast they were? And then we get back to our own reality to apply it. Another concept which is important is called the concept of redundancy. And that has to do with the idea of that communication processes that I was talking at the very beginning. There are certain elements in history, in historical events, or in the reading of the Bible that give us a kind of surplus of understanding. And that is what Segundo calls redundancy. There are certain things which are not explicitly there, but that we guess, that we interpret, and then we can understand better the message. Okay? And finally, the combination of systematic theology, or the systematic with the biblical. One of the main characteristics of Segundo is that he combined speculation with application of the biblical message. And that is because in his way of doing things, he says also, you cannot speculate forever, either way, just on the academic way of doing theology, without having conclusions or making conclusions out of what you read in the history of the people of Israel. So, I would say, regarding the origins of Segundo's liberating theology and liberation theology in general, so those are elements, yeah. In general, I have indicated that that theology predates the Second Vatican Council. Now, one last point. However, we must have that, contrary to popular belief, a systematic and comprehensive liberation theology has never existed. Rather, what has always existed is a set of theologies whose fundamental and convergent axis is their commitment to the liberation and humanization of people. We also must highlight that the connection between Segundo's liberating theology and the idea of the beginning of faith is strong, as I just indicated. This idea implies that the beginning of God's grace in humankind is already supernatural, because no one can begin or receive something that is beyond their capabilities. In a theological context, this means that the human virtues of non-believers must already be considered supernatural. On the other hand, this idea is not new, as I have already explained. It had already originated in the 6th century and had already been dealt with in the Second Council of Orange. But now, if we truly believe that God is the creator of the universe, and that God has been present and active in history, then that's the most important conclusion at this point. It cannot be said that human salvation will only take place in another world. Salvation, that's Segundo's conclusion, is a process already underway in history. And in this process, the use of historical means is necessary to achieve it. The function of a church, then, is that of faith, offering liberating and salvific factors in its liturgy and its understanding and presentation of the Christian faith. So what can we conclude? I would say Segundo is not a liberation theologian in the way that it has been popularized. In my view, Segundo is a liberating theology that tries to liberate theology and present faith in light of the contemporary understanding of the world, and that includes science. Segundo does interdisciplinary theology. It's not just about theology. I began by telling you about the ways of describing or seeing philosophy, and I said that those things could also be applied eventually to theology. We can debate about that, but I think many of those things will help. Segundo reformulates the Christian faith. In his understanding, grace helps us to be sensitive to the suffering, to the pain of the other. Grace is not something that it is ethereal without consequences. It is reflected in what we do, the sympathy, the compassion that we deal with the one who is in human conditions. Grace makes us sensitive to the pain of the other. And then the question is, why very often we only talk about the suffering of Jesus? Why is it? I was in Malaga a couple of weeks ago, and I was overwhelmed. I saw the Virgin Mary that they have, Our Lady there, and the poor image was with one cloth, another cloth, another cloth. It was impossible to walk. And I kept thinking, what kind of Christianity is that? The clothes, dark, terrible, but with crowns of gold and rings. What kind of image? What has that image to do with Mary of Nazareth? But that's the alienation of Christianity, or at least a reflection of that. So, finally, I want to say the following. Through his ideas and writings, Segundo continues to be alive. And we, those who read his books, continue to benefit from all that he did. May his ideas and teaching continue with us for the years to come. Happy 100th anniversary of Segundo's birth. Thank you so much for listening to the presentation.